Hey, Steady Steve. Okay, so listen, there's a little bit of background. I've got over 10 years experience in housing and specifically homelessness and specifically with rough sleeping. And I was kind of encouraged and fascinated to hear about Andy Burnham's pledge to end rough sleeping. That's a very multifaceted and complex thing to solve. So you would assume, and with cautiousness, was a little bit skeptical about what he actually meant. So for the very first time, I've done a little bit of searching on Google, aka put it into AI, and let's see about what he's actually talking about. So, a national housing first. That's the first problem. That is the first problem right there. Housing first. Okay, so I think the concept is for the everyday person, and Andy Burnham, I don't know his background, but if you're not from Manchester, he's just a random bloke that we don't know. Right. This housing first principle, and it's echoed in the Mayor of London's current strategy for homelessness and rough sleeping in particular, and that may well come up quite a few times. Now, just as a bit of background, it's very important. The old principle of housing first did not ignore the fact that not every piece of accommodation is suitable. It does not apply to everybody, but a typical problem of rough sleepers, and you're going to know this, but it may not be front of mind. But let's just say it's complex needs. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, especially if we're talking about entrenched rough sleepers, and entrenched just means whatever you quote as long term. Right, so those complex needs may well be undiagnosed and untreated mental health issues of various types. And as a coping mechanism, or however you want to phrase it, whether it came about as a result of homelessness or as a cause, sometimes drugs and alcohol. Complex needs, right? So, bearing in mind people have got complex needs, a complex problem, guess what, usually requires a somewhat complex solution. You're going to get people, bear with me on this, please bear with me on this, with at the lower end of complex needs, you might be able to fit into something generic. Generic is an everyday tendency. You pop them into a house, low needs, light touch, hopefully you set up the direct debits, good to go. But what do you do with the complex needs? And you might have a conversation to yourself or with people who are informed about what percentage of, in particular, entrenched rough sleepers are going to have undiagnosed mental health problems. And really what that echoes is they need support. And it's going to be the level of support. And that's another important facet. So on the other end, you're going to have people with the drug and alcohol side of things, and they're either going to need a lot of support, in which case they need in-house support in order to manage things, or some support in another facet. Now, if it's in-house support, really what you're talking about is no matter how you look at it, there are certain minimums. One of those minimums might well be, if you are looking after a vulnerable person, don't forget that, right? A vulnerable person with a mental health maybe, and or drug and alcohol. I'm not talking about weed side of things, we're talking about hard drugs which will bring about death. Inevitably, medical complications for the long term and death, right? So, as you think as a caring person, as a caring society, we want to bring about a pathway which solves those things, and then that person can get on with the rest of their lives and be happy and healthy. So you've got the kind point of view, you want them to get their lives back together. And from a selfish point of view, whilst they're in a state of dysfunction and drugs and alcohol are part of it, then we're talking about drug dealers, we're talking about chaos, we're talking about antisocial behaviour, we're talking about one person having a detrimental effect on the community around them. Let's just say, for instance, they're in a generic tenancy, they've got those types of needs with drugs and alcohol, but what about the kids that live next to them? What about the kids in the community? What about the antisocial behaviour at all hours when people want to get to work and they are playing by the social contract, and there's somebody at their stage of life which isn't quite ready? So you bring that right back to housing first. It used to be about, well, what is suitable? And if suitability is generic housing, we talk about the lower end of needs. But if we're saying hand on heart that a lot of rough sleepers, especially as they become more entrenched, are just more likely, given experienced, to have complex support needs which often touch on drugs and alcohol, then maybe the generic option is not the tailored solution for a group of people. Keep that front of mind. When this housing first thing gets put together, really what they're talking about is not providing a solution in order that somebody can be put onto a pathway where they overcome those main obstacles to sustainability and avoiding homelessness, tackling drugs and alcohol, and also tackling mental health if they happen to be issues. They're talking about handing somebody a set of keys and closing the door and hoping to somehow motivate themselves to go along to drug and alcohol, and have absolutely no conditions and not necessarily an inclination at that stage of their life to do. which will ultimately save their life. But if if you're not hitting the jackpot, imagine a massive roulette wheel and there's only like one segment on that wheel which is jackpot and everything else is failure, and just leads to them basically killing themselves in a heartbreaking way behind a closed door, and you literally handed them the keys to the door in an inappropriate solution. They're going to continue that drug and alcohol habit. They're not going to get their lives back together. They may well, in all likelihood, touch on antisocial behavior, which affects the wider community. And ultimately, the end destination for somebody on hard drugs pathway is usually an untimely death. And then they just become a statistic and the whole system repeats itself. The other way to look at it is with a tailored solution, and as an add-on to that, as soon as antisocial behaviour becomes a problem, and it may well be when people live in chaos and they've got chaotic friends, to get them out of that accommodation is probably going to be, 9 months to a year of serious disruption to the whole community. Nobody wins. All right, so let's rewind to what used to be a housing first principle. And again, I'm not trying to be in the mind of Andy Burnham. What it used to be was an emphasis on making an assessment of needs and placing them into what may well be suitable. So if generic housing is not an option because you place them in the tenancy, there may well be drugs and alcohol, they may not be ready to pay bills, they may well divert, rent money towards hard drugs because you know what, they've got an addiction and addictions are overriding. If you're going to hand somebody, especially London rents, and they've got a choice between addiction and paying bills which include rent, guess where that rent money's going to go? And if those outcomes are significantly predictable, then maybe it's not something that we should be doing. So again, if we rewind to what housing first used to be, if a generic tenancy is not going to be the solution, then you've got to put them into some kind of hostel. Now, hostels represent two problems. Problem number one in the eyes of a politician is the person may well say no. And this is a very important aspect to understanding homelessness, in that a lot of homeless are particularly choosy, especially if they have a drug addiction. And part of the reason why they're particularly choosy is because they've got chaotic friends that live in a particular community, and they've got a drug dealer that they don't want to be too far from. And those, in addition to everything else, are two very persuasive things which they may well choose to rather be homeless than to be housed. Right, now if that is the situation, how do you respond to that? Do you allow somebody to be in a tent in a park? So a lot of people, the everyday public, can be walking past and saying, well, what are the council doing about that? Well, what the council did do was offer them the most suitable accommodation. That is not a tenancy right next to the people that are complaining, when you can predict in advance that given the chaos that surrounds them, and that may well be drug addiction and everything else, rather than place them right in the middle of a community, they need, as their first step towards rehabilitation and getting their lives back together, somewhere where there's people on site which at least have minimal ground rules of, you're not going to take drugs on site, you're not going to take weapons on site, you're not going to be stealing things and storing them in the rooms. Basically, with a license you can actually get people out without having to go to court. And then when you get them out, if and when you get them out, it's not the end of the story. After that, it's about building a relationship and saying, listen, you've got to respect these minimal rules. The next time we get a space, otherwise known as a void, we'll bring you in. Please just abide by these minimal rules. No stealing, no drugs on site, no taking drugs on site, no weapons. And there may well be other things, but there's always going to be a minimum. But the fact is, somebody can't live within the minimum. Why would you ever put them in a tenancy? And if you do, you've got to blame yourself when inevitable and predictable things happen. Now, the reason why I'm making this clear, that housing first thing, this housing first statement here, is going to come up again and again. And they're saying it like they actually understand the problem. And in their mind, they're thinking about the everyday generic person. Whereas if they're going to be homeless, we'll just put them somewhere else. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about rough sleepers. So you've got to understand what the drivers are that lead to this person and people of a particular cohort who have a specific set of problems becoming homeless. And a few of those are what I've already suggested. That from their state of addiction, they are never going to pay bills, because they have got to tackle that first. If you can put it a nice way, they've got to show some evidence of building the life skill that they can prioritise. And that is very rarely going to be in the middle of addiction. And especially if that brought about repetitive homelessness in the recent past or in the near past or in their last settled accommodation. And I guarantee you a lot of the time it is going to be extremely predictable. But do these politicians have enough to explain that if somebody remains on the street, it is because they were offered or are being actively considered for suitable accommodation? Should they not take up that opportunity By suitable accommodation, again, I'm talking about a hostel where people are on site and they can check for the minimum, the drugs and weapons, and that they're not stealing, and just whatever the minimum rules are again. And if they can maintain the minimum and they agree to the minimum, and you're building a relationship whilst they're on the streets, and you're making sure that they're relatively comfortable as much as they're going to be on the streets, and they acquire tents, again, I guess that's through charities and things like that. And if they can be considerate, which they either will or won't be, because it's hard to be totally considerate from a position of chaos. And if you take away everything and somebody knows they can survive, then they don't really have any boundaries that they don't have to willingly accept. For most people, the everyday person, the threat of homelessness is enough for compliance. But what if that threat is not a weapon anymore because they know they'll survive? You know what I mean? So you've got to be mindful of things, and you've got to be kind, and you've got to be trauma informed, and you've got to stick with it, and you need to be persistent. Yeah, welcome to the world of homelessness. But it is not placing somebody somewhere which is unsuitable. Then you hand them a set of keys, as I said before, and you know that person is killing themselves behind that door with drugs, and you are enabling it. And again, on the route to their final destination, they're creating a whole lot of chaos around them, which affects absolutely everybody in predictable ways. Anyway, let's read on. Outside 10 Downing Street, his strategy scales up the regional models he pioneered as Mayor of Greater Manchester to transition from expensive short-term fixes to permanent housing solutions. So, depends what he means by short-term fixes, but mostly it's probably going to be, well, listen, a hostel can be considered a short-term fix. It just happens to be the most suitable option because you've actually got trained staff on site, in theory, that can build the life skills which enable them to sustain accommodation. How's about that? But once you factor in the fact you need CCTV, you need to buy a whole hotel or a dwelling with multiple rooms and shower and everything else you need to provide, obviously that's very expensive, and there's security as well, out of hours most likely, particularly expensive. Ooh, but I wonder if we just put them into a generic tenancy with no CCTV, no security, and no support staff, would that be cheaper? Will definitely be cheaper, but is it going to put them on a pathway, or is it going to delay a problem until they eventually get evicted and come round in a cycle? Then what's the solution going to be from there, once we've learned that they weren't ready? Hopefully it's not, which it is, that under a housing first principle, you just throw them into another tenancy with predictable outcomes. This is the problem. This is the problem. I say the Mayor of London, as well as our Prime Minister, are of the same mind, trying to get a sounds good, fits all solution to a tailored problem. The tailored solution is you assess somebody, you look at their needs and where they need to be, and you need to have some kind of minimal standards again. No weapons, no drugs, no criminality, respect others, no threatening behaviour. Obviously, whatever their minimums are, we'll all agree. And that demonstrates tenancy readiness. They're going specifically against the concepts or evidence which is contrary to tenancy readiness for people right now. It's just never going to work, and it's predictable. The housing first philosophy. This model views a secure, permanent home as a stable foundation rather than an earned reward. What they're trying to say is housing is a fundamental, and aren't we acting like gods, basically, to take away a permanent solution? What about, again, if this person is on a journey and they need a tailored and suitable housing solution initially, and that may well not be permanent, and that will suit both sides. Again, knowing how long the court process takes to get somebody out, they may well be dead from predictable consequences. Again, if drugs and alcohol are involved, which they may well be heavily involved right from the get-go with predictable outcomes. An honest and insightful approach would always focus on the most suitable housing solution above throwing people in somewhere with predictable outcomes in what may be quoted long term. It's not necessarily going to be quotes long term. And what is long term? Is it only long term because the court process is so long? In this instance, probably. And the evidence requirements to say if somebody is particularly antisocial is never quick. And there's a lot of energy that has to go to it from the people who are suffering from it. And yeah, I don't like it at all. It's very short-sighted and it's not going to work, but it will paper over cracks. Anyway, let's read on. Individuals are placed straight into long-term accommodation before addressing secondary needs like addiction or employment. There's another person, a prominent politician, and he tells you how it's going to fail right from the get-go, almost like it's a virtue. They're saying yeah, we're gonna place them straight into long-term accommodation before addressing the drivers of homelessness, which addiction is just a word there, but honestly, but anybody, if you sit down and give it a little bit of forethought, as you know, you can see where the predictable problems are going to be. And most definitely, anybody with addiction is a primary problem, especially with the harder drugs. Yeah, they probably need to be in a hostel more so than a long-term tenancy. Even if that hostel needs to be long-term, but definitely not a tenancy where you've got to go to court to get them out. Anyway, the point of view, I guess. Immediate 1,200 homes acquisition. The first phase of the investment focuses on acquiring suitable properties to immediately provide secure homes for thousands of people. Right, so listen, let's have a situation here, right? So again, you've got the spectrum. So the lower end of, let's say, a rough sleeper, an entrenched rough sleeper, not somebody who says they've been sleeping in their car for 1 or 2 days, right? An entrenched rough sleeper, and again, usually neglected mental health and maybe drug and alcohol support. I'm talking about at the extreme, right? So the reason why I'm bringing that up is because they're going to put those people into what I would say is unsuitable accommodation, straight into long-term tenancies. They're going to buy all these homes, which may well be right next door to you, which you won't be able to get them out from for a very long time, probably, let's say, plus a year. And that year may well be an absolute, not definitely, may well be an absolute nightmare. So let's just say somebody's got hard drugs, one that begins with C, one begins with H, they're injecting and things like that. So the second they move in next door to you, or whoever's reading this, that house becomes a crack house, right? The second they move in, by definition, it's a house where that particular narcotic is being consumed, right? Listen, newsflash, they live in complete chaos. They don't know their own mind. They're suffering with addiction. Now, that makes them both as a victim suffering from addictions and perpetrator from the predictable antisocial behaviour. Not for every single one of them, but it's predictable for many, right? 1,200 homes from this big pot of money, 340 million, which may well be right next door to you or within your community, and welcome to you, all those drug dealers, which will be coming at all hours. No need to thank the good intentions of Andy Burnham in this situation when you've got their chaotic friends and at the extreme, drug dealers being invited into your community on a regular. How's that going to work out? Is that an insightful solution knowing what the problems are? I would definitely say not. Especially when they say secure. It shouldn't be secure. Secure as in rights under the law from a tenancy. What they need is a license, which is not secure. But again, that will usually come with on-site support in order to get them their lives back and give them helpful boundaries. It's not an obstacle to homelessness. It is a necessary step towards actualization. Point of view thing, but I've made my intentions and my point of view clear. Intensive wraparound support. This is completely untrue in my point of view. I haven't seen the detail, but it's not possible for a start, but it must be done. The opening investment provides tailored intensive support packages for at least 3,000, so drop in the ocean, individuals facing the most severe long-term forms of homelessness. All right, so start off from the start again, housing first. So they are placed into a tenancy. Right, let's just say whoever's listening to this, right, say if you required this intensive support, right, and you're in your tenancy, guess one way around that intensive support? Maybe I just don't open the door. Yeah, right? But there's another aspect to this which is misleading. I don't think it's entirely honest. This is unconditional on engaging with support. The tenancy won't be conditional. It's not possible to be conditional if somebody signed a tenancy. There's no subdivision in the tenancy or right under the law or restriction under the law which says you have to engage with available support if the local council says so or thinks so. You know what I mean? That does not exist. They don't have to engage with it. They may need intensive support, and of course, that would mean they have to have usually on-site support. Intensive support usually is going to have to be on-site by definition. You can't have somebody who knocks on your door every so often and again. One of the main barriers may well be they just don't answer the phone and they just don't answer the door. That means they're never going to get that support that they need. And the concept of wraparound is the antipathy of what is realistically possible. Okay, say if you meet somebody and they're an adult, are they going to want to see you every day? It's an adult. It's meant to be unconditional support. That person may well be supporting whatever other number of people. We're talking about loose contact a couple of times a week, maybe once every couple of weeks. Realistically, it's an adult. If they've got ongoing issues and if they're not willing to accept support, whether they need it or not, and they're not obliged to accept support, and of course they're not going to be in a generic tenancy, aka the type of housing agreement that they're talking about here, this wraparound support is definitely overstating the point. And even if there was, what we're talking about is really signposting to help in terms of drug and alcohol, just continuous ongoing support, or encouragement to engage with that, and they either will or they won't. And anybody who's in the middle of addictions, who's dealing with a stranger who's called a support worker, it may well be a long period before they're ready to even contemplate it, and you're on a kind of pathway to get there, one day at a time. Again, especially if you're contacting somebody or able to contact them very sporadically, then it's just never going to happen quickly. And even if you tried to do it a couple of times a day or on a regular, then they would just block you because they're not ready. And it's one of these things, if you understand the process and you understand addiction, it's never a simple thing. And they have to get themselves there. So you've got to have a realistic timeline, and they will get themselves there when they're ready, and all you can do is encourage. Wraparound and intensive support is unrealistic unless we're talking about a hostel, and that's not what they're talking about. Local leader empowerment. Strategy delivery relies heavily on local authorities and regional mayors, allowing them to implement proven community-focused approaches. Listen, that goes completely against everything about housing first that came before. They're overlooking the principal core issues which creates homelessness and does, or breaks the cycle of homelessness. Absolutely. And as I say, the saddest thing about it is if you hand somebody a set of keys and access to big chunks of money through the rent, which may well go on the same addictions, we're talking about not actualization, we're talking about the end of days basically becoming that much sooner, and it's heartbreaking. Boosting social and council housing. A broader commitment to building new council housing to sustainably tackle the underlying housing shortage and bring down the welfare bill. Well, one of the obvious things that they need to do, right, and there's a lot of things about the Renters' Rights Act. One of the things they would obviously need to do, and I've seen it mentioned elsewhere, is stop selling affordable housing so it goes straight back on the market at some point in the future at market rates. Stop selling the stock. What they need to do, councils or anybody who thinks that rents are a real issue or rights overall, they need to bring up the standard. And that is not telling private enterprise to charge less than market rates, or somehow the government having an influence on what market rates are. What they need to do is stop selling their own stock, start building their own stock, start buying homes in order to add to their own stock, and then charge whatever price they think is the fair price and be the fairest landlord in the world. But then as soon as there is enough housing out there for there to be a realistic choice, well, who wouldn't choose a fair landlord at fairer prices, aka lower prices? Who wouldn't choose that? But it's never going to happen if they're selling off their stock, right? Never going to happen. It's like leaving the tap. It's like leaving the tap on and the plug out. It's never going to catch up, right? And if it takes quite a lot in order to build, or somehow we've reached saturation. I'm in London, okay, so obviously house prices are of a particular premium, and maybe we actually want to have some greenery. Maybe we want to have parks and not build over every single inch of a city which already has a lot of people and a lot of accommodation. You know what I mean? We need to, again, buy, don't sell. Then we're having a sensible conversation, otherwise it's just words. Systemic prevention. Integrated public services will look to target health inequalities, ease cost of living pressures, and provide early intervention to stop people falling into homelessness. Now we're going from rough sleepers to preventative things. Okay, so it's going to be interesting. Health inequalities and housing. Well, sorry, homelessness. Okay, we look at the loosest things before we get into things. Maybe it's like a distraction. And I know I mentioned about mental health earlier, but it's obviously health inequalities. Okay, I'm thinking rough sleeper brain. And prevention. You can't prevent somebody that's already homeless. You know what I mean? I guess, but they're trying to prevent people becoming homeless. Health inequalities. Okay, ease cost of living pressures. Make housing more affordable. What do they really mean? It's just words at the moment, isn't it? So they are talking about altering tax thresholds and things like that, and VAT. So I guess that's perhaps what they mean. But all needs to be costed. Let's just say that they did do that. Then obviously they're going to have less money to be interventionist in something else. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, because it depends what they're doing, but the words have a cost. You know what I mean? So yeah, anyway, we'll see. Foundations from Greater Manchester. The national strategy builds directly on the local initiatives Burnham championed as mayor, which are detailed on platforms like the Greater Manchester Combined Authority website. A bed every night, a scheme providing emergency night shelter beds and immediate support workers. There are homeless hostels everywhere. I do think that is a good idea. Again, we're talking about on-site support, we're talking about the CCTV. Other places I've seen, not in London but around the country, they have breakfast and lunch and things like that. It's either on site or nearby, and yeah, we want everybody to have somewhere safe, at least most of the time. If it's not available all of the time, we want them same to be on a pathway in order to get their lives back together for everybody's benefit. So that already exists anyway. Integrated delivery units, the creation of dedicated regional units to coordinate multi-borough resources, medical care and housing placement. Yeah, a lot of those hostels, I've seen them with psychologists on site. More often they'll have dentists, somebody, you know, has not had access to a dentist while on the streets. Others will have GPs that come in, or a nurse, somebody to tend to medical needs and make an assessment, which is amazing. Some, and again, I don't want to make it seem like it's over generous, it's most definitely not. They may have washer machines and drying machines, thankfully, where they can actually, and showers where they can actually have a shower. And of course, you can imagine being on the street for any period of time, whatever you've washed and things like that, dirty again. So it's an awful life. We just want people to get their lives back together and be healthy and safe. Good landlords charter. Efforts to improve standards in the private rented sector to keep vulnerable tenants secure. I guess what they're trying to say is create obstacles to landlords evicting people. Like, let's just say housing is most definitely an example. Anything that you own, say you buy a nice watch or something like that, and the government says you can only sell that watch for less than the market rate. Does that sound round about right? Does that sound right? Say if you or your parents or your grandparents work towards an asset, say a house, and you buy that house, and the government says you don't have a right to do what you want with it. And again, the real solution, if the government wants change or to set prices, is for the government to not sell its housing stock and to buy more housing stock. But if somebody, a private individual, wants to sell what is theirs, then they should be able to do it without significant problems. And yes, of course, there needs to be a balance. Of course, there needs to be a balance. So whatever time frame that is, fair enough. But somebody who owns an asset should be able to get it back, is what I think. And that's the reality of renting, or what I think it should be. But there is a fair balance. As I worked in housing for quite a long time, it's not fair if a tenant has no intention of paying the rent and or is antisocial, and it takes over 12 months or whatever a significant period is to get them out, to get your property back. That is not fair. Responses and perspectives. The strategy has been met with both enthusiasm and scrutiny from various groups. Homeless charities, organisations like Crisis and St Mungo's have heavily praised the strategy. They state it is a vital shift away from simply managing homelessness towards tackling its root causes. It's really not. It's really not. But everybody's point of view is absolutely fine. Political critics. Skeptics point out that while rough sleeping figures in Greater Manchester dropped initially, whilst Burnham was mayor, they began rising again after 2021 due to the wider cost of living and systemic pressures. Critics argue a national pledge will require far harder work and stricter accountability to succeed when local targets fell short. So sorry for the long video, there's a lot to it, and you need to understand the layers to understand why this strategy will most definitely fail, but it will paper over the cracks. But the most vulnerable people are just significantly less likely, in my point of view, with a lot of experience over 10 years, to actually get their lives back. But it will impact a lot of people. Was it 1,600? 1,200 homes. So throughout the UK, there will be significantly more people who are living amongst an ongoing dynamic problem, which is entirely predictable. And these vulnerable rough sleepers need to be somewhere else, and they need to actually demonstrate that they are tenancy ready, more so than just blindly having predictable outcomes, placing somebody where it is unsuitable. Please like, subscribe, let me know your thoughts in the comments. That is Stephen, I'm out.